Do you know what makes you tick? I'm Joseph. This is Input English. Today we're going to talk about the driving force, that which motivates us. In other words, what makes you tick. Let's start with a story. In a previous video, I talked about visiting the battlefield at Gettysburg. While we were on that trip, something interesting happened, something very unexpected and very positive. We did not stay in Gettysburg. It was super busy with a lot of tourists, and we couldn't find accommodations that suited us. And so my wife sourced a bed and breakfast in Hanover. It's about 16 miles to the east, another small town in eastern Pennsylvania, and she found us a nice bed and breakfast. We had reservations, we showed up, went in to check in, and it looked odd. I mean, it was nice enough, it was great, it was a kind of Victorian decor, but the odd thing about the room that we entered when we came into this house is there were clocks everywhere. All surfaces had clocks on them. There were multiple grandfather clocks standing around the room. There were dozens of clocks. And on closer inspection, they were ticking. They were working. We checked in and took our bags up to the room and settled in. It was nice enough. And then I came down and found the owner of the house who ran this bed and breakfast, and I said, "What happened here?" And he looked at me, not exactly knowing what I was driving at. And then I gestured into the room and he said, "Oh, the clocks." And I said, "Right. How come you have so many?" He said, "Well, it's kind of a long story." And then he told me a long story, which I will distill down to a much shorter story. He had retired. He had some time on his hands. He took a clock repair class and learned how to fix clocks at a local facility. And then he started buying them at flea markets, estate sales, etc. And every time he would buy a clock that didn't work, he could repair it, get it working, and then either sell it or keep it. He did a lot of keeping. He had a lot of clocks. Most of these clocks had price tags on them. He was willing to sell them to people who wanted to buy them, and they all worked. I asked him a whole bunch of questions because this was very interesting, and I learned a lot talking to that guy. I then went upstairs and logged onto the internet to learn more. My wife had taken a trip downstairs and she found a stand with a bunch of brochures for tourist attractions, places of interest that had been placed out for the visitors to peruse. And then she came bounding up the stairs with a brochure in her hand. And as she came in the room, she said, "Do you realize there is a clock and watch museum in Columbia and we're going to drive right past it?" Well, while she was gathering that information downstairs, I had actually been on the website of that museum and had decided that we needed to visit it. We had the time, so in response to her statement, I said, "No, we're not going to drive right past it. We're going to stop and go through it." We spent more than 3 hours in that museum. It was fabulous. It was very interesting. And we found out that they gave classes on clock and watch repair. Some of the classes were there in Columbia, Pennsylvania, but they also coordinated for classes all over the country put on by chapters of this organization. This was the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors in Columbia, Pennsylvania. A bunch of hobbyists interested in 100-year-old technology. Well, not everybody's interested in 100-year-old technology, but I was interested in it because of my curiosity. Growing up, we saw lots of clocks. Many of them were not very interesting. They were electric clocks. They plugged into the wall with a cord, and they made a humming sound, and they kept pretty good time. There was a grandfather's clock in my grandfather's house, but the hands were missing, and it didn't do anything. But when we were little kids, we would peek inside the case of that grandfather's clock. What we saw was the set of gears inside the clock. Peeking into that grandfather clock case gave me a lot of curiosity. What's in there? How's it work? In the case of that clock, it didn't work. It needed to be repaired. After we went through that museum, I found that there were classes that I could take to learn how to do clock repair. And so I looked at the calendar and picked out a class and registered for it. And I went to that class. It was in Kansas City. I flew in, stayed in a hotel, rented a car, and attended the class during the day. We had each brought a clock movement. So what's a clock movement? Well, for that class, it was something that looked like this. So this clock movement is about 120 years old. This was manufactured by the Seth Thomas Corporation, and it was 19th century technology. This was old technology, but it was made rather well. And these were factory made. These were not handmade clocks. These were made in factories with machines. These were the product of the Industrial Revolution 100 years before this. So each of the students had a clock like this, and we had some basic tools, and we, under the tutelage of an instructor, took this thing apart completely down to individual gears and screws and springs, and then cleaned them all. When I started taking off these nuts here, and here, I realized that this case was going to come apart, and all these wheels and levers were going to be freed of their cage and were going to mingle with each other in strange ways. And then the scary part for me is, how would I ever be able to put them back in the right order? And what if I got it all back together and I had an extra part? What if there was something left over? And if there's something that I didn't put back in, you know it's not going to work. So I had a lot of fear about that. When I opened up the case in the class, the first thing I did was pull out a cell phone and take a bunch of pictures so that I could identify the relationships of the different wheels so that I could reassemble it. It seemed prudent to me. The instructor was much older than me. He was nearly 80 years old and very experienced, and he came up and was completely amused by what I was doing. He could see the wisdom of the thought process, but he knew more about these clocks than I did. And he said, "Don't worry about that. That's what this class is all about. We're going to show you how to keep track of those wheels and how to put them back in the right order. And when you're done, you will have no leftover parts and your clock movement will work. Now take all those wheels out and put them in that basket because we need to clean them." I did. We put them into an ultrasonic cleaner with cleaning solution, and they came out very clean. The class progressed. He explained about how the clock movement worked. He looked at each of our specimens and pointed out areas that had worn, things that we needed to correct. At one point, I said, well, what if we're missing one of these screws? what do we do? Can you buy a replacement? And he said, no, nobody makes replacement parts for these. He said, you either take it from another clock movement that you have, like a junkyard, or you just make it. And I thought, make it? He said, yeah, just make it, on the lathe. Just take a piece of steel or brass, whatever you want to use, and turn it to the right dimensions, cut a slot in the head, cut the threads, just make a new screw. It's not that big a deal. I thought, man, this is for me. Now you could say, why are you wasting your time on 100-plus-year-old technology? Why don't you focus your time on software and artificial intelligence and more modern things that are going to have a little more payoff for you if you learn those things? And that argument has merit. I understand that. But as we started this episode, I pointed out that we're discussing what's our motivating force? What's the driving force behind what we do? What makes us tick? And for me, it's super clear. Curiosity. Since I was a little kid, I wanted to know how things worked. And so for me, taking this clock movement apart, cleaning it, reassembling it, and making it work was not a matter of creating a new career as a clock repair person. No, it was to satisfy my needs to know how things work. This is one of my favorite movements. This is a Seth Thomas 89, and it's just a pleasure to work on. There were a bunch of movements that I worked on in these classes. And when you take one of these apart and clean it and reassemble it, you get to see the genius behind what these people were doing with that old technology. They were solving problems mechanically, not electronically or with computer circuitry. They were solving real life problems with mechanical solutions, bearings, levers, springs, forces, etc. I love this number 89 Seth Thomas movement. They're a joy to work on. Now, sometimes these movements got really complicated. This is a later Seth Thomas movement, and this has more features. This is a much more complicated movement. This is a 113, and this one is a nightmare to take apart and put back together, but it satisfies my need to know how these things work. Over the years, I took a bunch of classes in clock repair. We took some classes on watch repair, and I disassembled a watch, cleaned it, reassembled it, and it worked. Pursuing this hobby of clock repair was never intended to generate income. It was never intended to become a business. It was simply because of intense curiosity. Fast forward to the pandemic. We had a lot of time on our hands, but I had this urge to satisfy curiosity, but we were quarantined. We couldn't go anyplace. We couldn't do anything. And so I started reading literature. And as I have said in other videos, it was that experience reading great literature from the Western canon that allowed me to realize that I really needed to learn another language. So in 2023, I began learning Spanish. The driving force behind that initially was curiosity. Many people would have expected that an adult learner of a language that they didn't know at all over the age of 50 would certainly fail. And I set out to prove that wrong. My curiosity was, could I prove them wrong? Could I mount such an intense effort to learn this language using proper methods that I could get positive results? Now, after I got into the study of Spanish, I found that I had great passion for the language itself. Curiosity is not always enough to get you the kind of results you want, because once you satisfy your curiosity, your activities in that arena may come to a stop. That has happened to me in other endeavors. So with Spanish, luckily, I got introduced to it by curiosity, intense curiosity, but then I just developed a great love of the language, the culture, and the associated art, including music. So after a while, it became self-sustaining. The reason I made this video is not to try to get you interested in repairing 100-year-old clocks. No, I wanted to discuss the concept of what's our driving force, what makes us tick. Because if we are in touch with that and we understand that, then we can use it to our advantage. In a few days, it will be January of 2025. We will be at the beginning of a brand new year. And the question for all of us is, what are we going to do with that year? What are we going to achieve? What are we going to learn? What are we going to benefit from? We all have this opportunity to look to the future and start making some decisions where we're going to focus our available leisure time. Will it be language learning? Will it be enjoying great literature? Will it be organizing travel to interesting places? How will we invest our discretionary time? The clock struck 12 noon. I have made some decisions on what I'm going to do in 2025. And in future videos, we're going to talk about those. Do you know what you're planning on doing with this coming new year? If you like videos like this, be sure to click on this one next. See you soon.